Let's get a word with Shanker Singham, who is the CEO of Competare Group and former advisor to the UK Trade Secretary. Good afternoon to you, Shanker.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
Yeah, good as gold. Nice to have you with us. So it's not an overstatement to say this is a deeply disturbing issue. It's got tentacles. It could go on for a long time. And it's not just a battle in the Middle East. It's affecting us over here.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the Straits of Hormuz, I think, as everybody knows, is a vital trading sort of choke point, if you will, and we're sort of seeing the effect that it's having, when it's shut on oil prices, on energy prices. There are certain countries that are more vulnerable to it than others. So particularly the East Asian countries, Korea, Japan, India, etc., are very vulnerable to these barriers. But we are all going to see the effect of this in terms of energy prices increasing. And of course, in the UK, we already have very, very high energy costs that are sort of 4 times the US sort of average. So we're already starting from a point of having extremely high energy costs, and this is only going to make it worse. I think you pointed out at the top of the hour the Stargate AI investment. Data center investment, not happening because of those energy costs. So it is very, very hard to be a competitive country with energy costs that are as high as they are in the UK. So this is not going to help, that situation.
So when Andrew Bailey makes that comparison, talking about the 2008, the whole subprime mortgage debacle and all that followed from that, do you think he overstates it, or has he called it correctly?
Well, I think that they're different things. I mean, I think the subprime market was an issue, much more to do with increased asset prices as a result of a lot of government distortionary regulation, I will say, in the financial and the banking sector that led to these products being available. You also had in the US, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the state-owned companies, essentially buying back the risk. You had a lot of incentive for the US banks to hold non-performing assets. So you had a sort of perfect storm of things that eventually broke. And because these entities had become so large and so systemically important, that created a risk. This is a very different thing. Obviously, this has been caused by a conflict. So there's a lot more variables at play with this because, if we're able to get a ceasefire, if we're able to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, or over time, if alternative routes are devised, and we're already seeing in the UAE, in Oman, in India, attempts to have alternative routes. I mean, the big shipping companies are looking at alternative routes because it's not only getting the straits open, it's the insurance risk that you have to deal with as well.
Yeah, and of course the knock-on effect is, I guess, what gets us as consumers. We can talk about trade and the wider economic implications, but in the supermarket, on the forecourt, those kind of areas, we're hearing about surge pricing and the like. This could be uncomfortable for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental problem here is that energy is in everything. When energy costs go up, everything becomes more expensive, sometimes significantly so. So if you look at steel, for example, about 40% of steel is energy cost. So and steel is in so many things that you buy, cars, you name it. And so when that cost goes up, the other problem we have in the UK is that we have not been growing the economy for about 25 years. I mean, if you look back at GDP per capita growth in the UK over the last 25 years, it's been a very stagnant picture. It's getting worse. In fact, and some might say that we're in a GDP per capita recession already because our GDP per capita is actually contracting. So, you can weather a lot of these shocks and you can weather a lot of these storms if your economy is fundamentally resilient and you are growing the economy at a reasonable rate. Go back 25 years, the US economy and the UK economy, roughly in terms of GDP per capita, about the same. Now the US economy is 40% richer than the UK economy, which means it's important for people. Individual households, individual families are 40% poorer in the UK than they are in the US and comparable places
Incredible.
in the
Pol-
so
pol-
you've got a lot of problems there that don't allow you
yeah.
to be resilient in the face of this kind of external shock.
Absolutely, and politicians used to love that phrase of fixing the roof while the sun shines. I can't remember how many of them have wheeled that one out, but of course it appears when I look upwards in this respect, Shanker, I'm seeing a big hole still in the roof, which I think is what you were alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to get back to growth. I mean, bottom line, I mean, we've got to do the regulatory reforms, the supply side reforms. I chair the Growth Commission. We've made recommendations to the UK and the US and the Japanese governments about how they can, improve the sort of economic growth picture. But, what we see on the ground is far from doing those things. We're seeing quite a lot of regulatory burden being increased. I think Stargate referred to not just the energy costs, but also the domestic regulatory picture in the UK. And, our economic models suggest a lot of GDP per capita in the UK is being lost as a result of the regulatory arrangement.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? You look back at, and I was looking at these figures the other day, look back at 2001. They were halcyon days, weren't they, when you look at GDP per capita and the like. You think, wow. But you've got to go back that far, really, to find any evidence of growth, which is extraordinary. A quarter of a century and more.
Yeah, and it's not true to say that the whole world is like this. It's not true to say that it's just a temper of the times, that we just don't have a hope anymore. The US has been a bit more resilient in terms of economic growth, but there's really no reason why we can't get back to the kind of growth we had at that time, or even in the sort of 80s and 90s when 2 to 3% GDP per capita growth was the norm. We are a long way away from the frontier, if you will, in terms of where growth starts to slow down.
Sure.
Because you can't do any more. You can't improve your economy. You can't improve your regulations anymore. We're a long way away from that. We could do a lot more, and there's a lot more innovation that we ought to be seeing in our economies that we're not seeing because we have not allowed the ordinary sort of growth forces to work.
What do you think happens here? Because I'm forever confused about. I mean, we should always be a bit confused about politicians, and politicians should always exist with a big question mark over their head, whatever party they represent. By dint of their desire to run things, I think is always a reason to question them. Some over the years have been incredibly successful business people. You're a very successful British businessman. You meet these people. You must. I mean, do they listen and then not act? Do you look from afar and think, what bit are you not getting? What breaks down here? Because this particular government, I know you're not here to talk specific politics, but this particular government doesn't have a lot of business experience on its front bench. That's just a fact. So you would think they would rely on voices like yours to go, this is how you do it. What breaks down between people like you, whether it's James Dyson, whoever is meeting with these people saying, look, this is what you need to do. And then you wake up the next morning and none of it is happening.
Yes, and quite often the opposite has happened. But I mean, I think what I would say is that there's lots of reasons for this. I think one, if you go back to Keir Starmer's original statement when he came in, that economic growth was the sort of primary purpose of this government, by which he meant wealth creation. Many of us sort of reacted to that and said, fine, that we agree with that entirely. And we know how to do it. We know how to help you achieve that goal, and we'll come in and help you. I think part of the problem is a lack of understanding about what economic growth actually is, where it comes from. It comes from the private sector. It comes from the literally billions of interactions between voluntary exchanges between willing buyers and willing sellers. Yep. It's at that level that economic growth actually happens and that wealth is actually created. Yeah. But there's a lack of understanding, I think, in politicians of all stripes, actually, that where growth actually comes from. It does not come from the government spending more. It does not come from the government printing more money. These are things that are anti-growth. Very often, but they don't see that. I think the other problem, and it's a bigger problem in a way, is that even were they to want to do the right things, the sort of bureaucratic process in the UK is so mired in treacle at the moment. It's really difficult to get things done. In fact, ironically, the Keir Starmer sometimes sounds like Liz Truss sounded like before she left office when he says that there's that we just found that the levers of power are not connected to anything.
Yeah.
We say we want to do something and then nothing happens.
I mean, a lot of what you just said there, though, is kind of sixth form economics, isn't it? Governments don't invent, innovate, advance, or manufacture. People like you do that, and those that are in associated and similar areas of business. And everybody knows that. It's not hard to get your head around that, but something clearly gets lost in translation.
And occasionally you'll get a little bright spark of something that's sort of going in the right direction. So, for example, the Fingleton review on nuclear regulatory, where he made a series of recommendations about eliminating some of the regulatory barriers, because it takes so long to build a nuclear power station in the UK. I mean, it takes 20, 25 years, whereas in other countries it's more like 5 to 10 years. And of course, we don't need to talk about planning and housing, and all of these things are virtually impossible to do in the UK, but there have been some sort of positive things that have happened, and I think one of the problems of the UK economy as an observer of it and an observer of many countries around the world, and we've worked in probably 80 countries around the world, what is very clear about the UK is that the regulatory bias favours the incumbent in the UK more so than in many other countries we've worked in, which means large incumbent companies tend to be the ones who determine what the regulatory system looks like, and that tends to disfavour new entrants, new businesses. People like James Dyson, who you mentioned. New entrepreneurs tend to be disfavoured by that, and they tend to go elsewhere, unfortunately. So, one of the things that any government in the UK needs to do is correct that balance and make the economy much more dynamic and much more favourable to entrepreneurs. There's a significant amount of the economy that consists of businesses providing services to the government. So, getting actual private sector economic activity to take off, which you can only do through sensible taxation, lower levels of regulation, lowering the size of the state, dealing with the welfare budget and so forth. I mean, the UK, we pay it's probably getting on for £300 billion a year just on our debt servicing and on the NHS. So just two things. And you're already a long way behind the curve if that's if that's where your starting point is. So you have to move on all of these things at the same time. And then what will happen if a government can do that is you'll start to see entrepreneurs coming back. You'll start to see new businesses being created. I always say to people, if you just look at the US stock exchange, the top 30 companies over the last 20, 30 years, they're totally different now than they were before. You've got the tech companies, the Mag 7, they're the dominant companies on the stock exchange. 20 years ago, none of them existed. In the UK, it's the same companies.
Yeah, that's incredibly telling. It's a great factoid to finish on. Listen, Shanker, great to have you on, sir. We will speak again, I'm sure. Appreciate your time. Shanker Singham, CEO of Competere Group, former advisor to the UK Trade Secretary, also advising around the world, particularly to the United States as well. I mean, isn't that interesting, that last point that he mentioned there in terms of where's our growth gone? Where's it all gone? Where is it? We still have a lack of innovation in many respects, and I think he alluded to the fact there that much of that is down to rules, regulations, bureaucracy that just simply stands in the way of creativity and innovation.